Therapists, what was your biggest, I'm not supposed to judge you, but holy moment? Story 1. A few years ago, I worked with a family for about a year, providing in-home therapy for 3 kids, a 10-year-old girl and 2 boys, aged 6 and 8, while also conducting parent training with their mother, who was in her early 30s. Their biological father and stepfather were both in jail for sexually abusing all 3 children, along with multiple drug charges and domestic violence offenses. One day I sent the mother a text, as I always did, letting her know I was on my way. The response I received sent a chill through me. "This is X. My mom died." She had suffered a heart attack in the middle of the night. The kids, thinking she was just sleeping in, spent the entire day cuddling beside her in bed, until a neighbor stopped by and realized she was gone. Then came the nightmare of the CPS system. Despite the existence of an estranged family member who desperately wanted to take them in, a woman who worked in family services, had a stable home, and could provide the first real security these kids had ever known. CPS made the decision to release their biological father from prison early so he could gain custody. He fired me the moment he got them. But the kids still found ways to reach me. They would call from their school's counselor's office, crying, recounting horrific stories of what was happening to them. I reported everything to CPS over and over again. But eventually I was told outright, "We don't want to hear it anymore. The circumstances aren't changing. Do yourself a favor and stop answering when they call." Over time, the call stopped. But not a single day has passed, even now, where I don't think about them. Last fall, I received a call at my current office. It was the girl. She wasn't even 16 yet, but she had already been through 3 pregnancies, each either aborted or miscarried. Her father had been pimping her out for years, forcing her to sell drugs. She'd done time in juvenile detention. The nightmare never ended for her. We fought CPS so hard for so long, and all we got in return was this life for those kids. I was so grateful she reached out to me. I'll never forget that caseworker's name, and I pray I never cross paths with her again. Story 2. I work at a residential group home. We had a kid who had been admitted about 4 months prior. During a family session, they casually mentioned having parasites. I was stunned. "What?" The mother nodded, completely unfazed. "Oh yeah, our whole family has them. We don't believe in getting rid of them since they're part of our biological ecosystem." I was absolutely dumbstruck. For the next 3 weeks, my team and I had to convince this family that parasites were, in fact, a public health concern. Other residents had fecal eating behaviors and various hygiene-related issues that could cause an outbreak in the unit. It wasn't just about them, it was a risk to everyone. It took 3 exhausting weeks of education, planning, and, worst of all, persuading both the kid and their mother that eliminating the parasites wouldn't lower their IQ. Lots of cognitive behavioral therapy sessions later, we finally got them to agree to treatment, but my God, it took way longer than any of us expected. Story 3. I once had a patient whose wife shook their baby to death. He wanted help reconnecting with her. At the time, I was a young father myself with a newborn at home. His case triggered something deep inside me, an overwhelming fear for my own child, a visceral hatred for his wife, and strangely, a kind of pity for him. Not the sympathetic kind, but the how pathetic kind. I tried to work with him. For 3 sessions, I did my best. I even met his wife, but I couldn't do it. I told my supervisor how I felt. She knew my initial reactions and tried to help me navigate them, but in the end, my emotions were too raw. I had to hand the case over. I was still new to the profession at the time. I knew things like this were bound to happen, but I wasn't prepared for just how much it would shake me. Story 4. I was in my psychiatrist's office for a routine bi-monthly 15-minute med check. Just the usual. She asked me how I was doing, more out of polite conversation than anything else. I told her that in the last 6 weeks, 3 elderly family members, my aunt and 2 uncles, whom I was guardian and conservator for, had died one after the other. My wife had a heart attack. My daughter attempted suicide. My mother broke her hip and was left lying on the floor for a week before anyone found her. She had survived by drinking and eating from the dog's bowls. I got that call just 10 minutes after finalizing arrangements for the last funeral. She didn't hesitate. She stopped the meeting, picked up her phone, and called a therapist in the office next door. She had them postpone their next appointment so I could talk to someone right then and there. I hadn't even realized how deep I was drowning. Looking back, I think she saved my life that day. Story 5. I don't often talk about my profession, but here goes. I was working at a drug and alcohol rehabilitation center when I had a client come in, a self-proclaimed drug lord. As we worked together, he shared his history, explaining how he had ended up where he was. At one point during our sessions, he admitted to selling his own sister into slavery. He had forcibly injected her with multiple sedatives and narcotics, and then had several men teach her a lesson. What that meant, he never elaborated on. He told the story with a blank expression, the only time he smiled being when he recalled the good times, which he defined as periods when he had enough hero to get through the day. I don't know where he is now, but he changed the course of my career. He made me want to work with victims of trafficking because they don't just face the stigma of selling their bodies. Many of them are also battling drug addictions, addictions to substances they were forcibly given. People would be shocked if they knew just how many trafficking victims are addicted to chemicals they never chose to take. Story 6. I feel like a lot of people who claim they never judge their clients either work in voluntary services or have simply been fortunate in the types of clients they've encountered. Judgment isn't inherently bad. It's how we recognize that murdering people is wrong. So when a convicted pedophile client told me, "Nothing gets me going like a pair of little girls' worn panties," you better believe I judged the hell out of him. Did I continue working with him? Yes. Did I treat him with compassion and respect? Yes, because he's a human being, and that's my job. But I can't sit here and say I didn't judge him. I judged that he should never be around children. I judged that he wasn't ready for change. I judged that any access to his own daughter should be strictly supervised. That's a lot of judgments. Understanding your own biases and how they influence your work is a crucial part of training and practice. Ignoring them doesn't make you a better therapist. It makes you naive. Story 7. A lot of people talk about pedophilia as one of the hardest things to navigate without judgment. Despite professional training, I haven't worked with a pedophile, at least not one who openly identified as such. But I did run a men's anger management group. Some of the men in that group had done horrible things to women, and yet most of them I found ways to respect, to recognize their positive qualities despite their pasts. But there were two men I could never find that unconditional positive regard for. One barely spoke during sessions. He gave one-word answers, complained about how unfair the system was, and refused to engage. I worked hard to break through, to connect, to help, but nothing ever changed. He left the group after he strangled his girlfriend and went to jail. She survived, thankfully. The other was barely involved. He showed up late, left early, did the bare minimum, and refused to open up. One session after we had already discussed him staying to the end, he got up to leave early anyway. When I told him he wouldn't get credit for attendance, something the court required, he threatened me. Oddly enough, I later ended up moving into the apartment directly below him without realizing it. I'd listen to him scream at his girlfriend, hear things breaking, and call the cops. I judge these men. They're awful people. Maybe they're redeemable, but redemption requires self-awareness and accountability. And neither of them wanted any part of that. It's worth noting how differently I felt about them compared to so many others in the group. Men I could help, men I could admire despite their pasts. But some people don't want to be saved. Story 8. I was part of a review for a secluded patient. The moment we opened the door, he threw a cup filled with urine and feces directly in my face. I tried to stay objective, to remind myself to consider his experience, but honestly, my first thought was just, what an asshole. Working in inpatient services is challenging. It takes a conscious effort to step back and remember that people with personality disorders, for example, often act out in ways that can seem bratty or manipulative in isolation. But when you look at the experiences that shaped them, the trauma that molded their reactions, it becomes easier to find compassion instead of judgment. That being said, it's a lot harder to be compassionate when someone bites me or smacks me with one of our wonderfully detachable anti-ligature curtain poles. Story 9. I'm a clinical psychologist, primarily working in forensics. My clients are usually involved in legal proceedings, family court, juvenile court, criminal court. My job is to evaluate or provide treatment, not to judge. That's the judge's job. But of course, I still have my thoughts. What never fails to infuriate me is the way some parents manipulate their children against the other parent. One case that stuck with me involved a 5-year-old girl. She told me she didn't want to see one of her parents anymore because they hadn't paid child support. Excuse me? A 5-year-old? What child that young even knows what child support is, let alone understands it enough to use it as a reason to reject a parent? It wasn't her words, it was her parents. And that, more than anything, disgusts me. Story 10. When I was underage, I got caught drinking on Bourbon Street and ended up with a minor in possession charge. Later, I was telling my therapist about it and casually mentioned that the police caught me with a hand grenade in New Orleans. Now, for those who don't know, a hand grenade is a type of cocktail. But he didn't know that. He paused. He blinked. Then, with genuine concern, he asked, "Where did you even find a grenade?" It took me a second to realize what he thought I meant. I quickly corrected him, explaining it was just a drink. But for that brief moment, I know he was sitting there thinking, holy how do I even begin to handle this? Story 11. When you as a therapist reach that point, it's time to start thinking about referrals. Be genuine with your client and then refer them out. You have to maintain unconditional positive regard, or you'll never achieve true therapeutic rapport. One case that comes to mind is a frequent caller to the Suez hotline. He would call in and refuse to provide his phone number or name. Instead, he would say that I had 10 seconds to convince him not to end his life, or he'd pull the trigger, and it would be my fault. Then he would start counting down from 10 to 1 while I was on the phone, desperately talking. At 1, he'd hang up. I'm sure the whole point was to make me feel guilty or to prove some kind of twisted point. I don't know. I had insufficient information to make a true assessment. But I have to admit, on the nights he called, especially the first time, I struggled to sleep thinking, that guy better not be dead. Story 12. When I was a teenager, I lived in a highly emotionally and mentally abusive household. I know some people don't take that kind of thing seriously, but it was so bad that a psychiatrist later diagnosed me with PTSD. One day, my abusive parents and I got into a heated argument in the car. My stepdad pulled over and said, "Get out. We're leaving you on the highway." I wasn't scared because I knew I could just call the police, tell them I had been abandoned, and they'd be in serious trouble. So I said, "Sounds good," and stepped out. My mom followed and immediately started attacking me. After the assault, I refused to get back in the car. My stepdad got out, dragged me by the hair, called me a bipolar beccagneur, and threw me inside. Later, they forced me to see a therapist. They told her that I had jumped out of a moving car and then attacked my mother when she tried to help. The therapist didn't believe a word I said and kept pushing for me to take bipolar medication. I knew I wasn't bipolar. I was being abused. My anger and sadness were completely normal for my situation. She glared at me and said, "You're not nearly as smart as you think you are." From that moment on, I refused to say a single word in our sessions. I would go in, sit down, and endure her sarcastic remarks for a few minutes before she dismissed me. She wasn't trying to help me. She was trying to help my parents. I moved out at 18, put myself through college with no financial help, got a job, and eventually left the country to get as far away from them as possible. I'm on antidepressants for PTSD now. And thankfully, the therapists I've had since then have been nothing like that horrible woman. But even now, the memory still upsets me. Story 13. I'm not a licensed therapist, but I worked as a behavioral health technician. Basically, I got a psychology degree and was trained in behavioral intervention techniques for children. My role was to help coach parents in supporting children with behavioral disorders. I rarely encountered a child with a clear mental illness the way I did when working with adults with severe psychiatric conditions. Most of the kids I worked with were confused, lonely, or struggling. Given that many of their parents were living in poverty, I truly believe that alleviating the burdens of financial hardship would have significantly reduced the severity of many of their symptoms. Advocating for affordable childcare and livable wages is a form of mental health advocacy. I often found myself judging, not the children, but their parents. Some parents would drop their kids off with a fix my kid attitude and then disappear. Now that I'm a parent myself, I understand the exhaustion and burnout a little more. But in those situations, the best I could do was provide the child with an hour-long glimpse of what it looked like to live in a loving, structured environment. I could always tell which kids were most at risk of being caught in the system for the rest of their lives, whether through institutionalization, homelessness, or prison. But whenever a concerned parent showed up and asked, "How do I help my kid?" I would practically jump for joy because that meant the child had someone who truly loved them and was willing to fight for them. Story 14. I work in mental health and have spent the majority of my career in acute and crisis settings. One of the most memorable experiences I've had was with a young person who came in struggling with severe, ongoing suicidal thoughts. They were dealing with a lot, and I spent a significant amount of time with them, mostly helping them de-escalate and figuring out the best plan moving forward. A little while later, one of their parents arrived. With the patient's consent, I sat down with the parent to explain what was going on and discuss ways they could support their child. Halfway through my explanation of some psychological concepts and strategies, the parent interrupted me with, "Is this going to take much longer? I have a show to go watch." All I can say is this: I never judge my patients. I haven't walked their path, and I haven't seen the world through their eyes. But the people around them, the ones who perpetuate their suffering through ignorance, malice, or selfishness, them I judge. Edit. I've tried to respond to as many comments as I could. Some have been insightful, others were likely trolling, but all of it has given me a chance to reflect on my own experiences. However, I need to get some sleep. If I can ask one thing from anyone reading this, remember that even the smallest gesture can help. A simple, "How are you?" or "I hope you're doing okay," can mean more than you realize. This year has been tough on all of us. And while I appreciate those who acknowledge the difficulty of working in mental health, the truth is, we've all struggled. Please be as kind as you can to each other. I hope we can all look forward to a better December and an even better new year. Edit 2. I want to clarify something about my use of the word judge. I do form judgments. It's nearly impossible not to, given what I see and the situations my patients have been through. But what I mean is that I don't let those judgments distort how I approach my work. My priority is always to help my patients and those around them, ensuring they have the support they need to achieve their goals. Final edit. I never expected this post to get so much attention, and I can't possibly respond to every comment. But I do want to clear something up. Many people have made assumptions about the parent I mentioned. Their statement about having a show to watch wasn't an attempt to deflect or remove themselves from the situation. And no, it wasn't about a TV show. Keep in mind, this entire experience lasted 5 to 6 hours for me, while you've read about it in just a few minutes. At the end of the day, those of us working in mental health have heard it all. We don't judge you for how you feel, and we genuinely want to help. I wrote this post in one sitting, simply wanting to share an experience and offer support in any way I could. While I appreciate the overwhelmingly positive response, I never intended to offend or upset anyone. And I certainly don't see myself as some unattainable example of perfect non-judgment. I just wanted to help. Story 15. Therapist here. To piggyback on what others have said, it's extremely rare for me to judge my clients. It happens occasionally, but I shut those thoughts down quickly and refocus on being present. People are incredibly complex, and judgment serves no real purpose in our work together. That being said, one thing that does frustrate me is when a client's parent actively tries to sabotage the therapeutic relationship I've built with their child. Sometimes they'll pull their child out of therapy entirely when our conversations begin to challenge certain unhealthy family dynamics. I don't feel anger toward these parents. Mostly, I just feel bad for the kid. Story 16. Patient perspective here. I had been seeing a therapist for a few months to help with chronic depression and self-harm, along with some pretty intense or suicidal thoughts. I had tried Suprax in the past, but didn't like the side effects, so I stopped. However, I was ready to try something new to supplement therapy. Everyone around me was calling Wellbutrin a miracle drug and a lifesaver, so I figured I'd give it a shot. Since my therapist couldn't prescribe medication, I scheduled an appointment with a psychiatrist. At my first session, I explained what I was struggling with, what I was doing to manage it, and what I hoped to get out of seeing him. I've always been good at holding myself together in public. I dress well, I've held down jobs, and at the time, I was living on my own. Now I live with my partner. In other words, I had a well-polished mask. I guess it was too good because, pretty early in the session, the psychiatrist looked at me and said, "I don't think you're depressed." Bro, this was the first time we'd met. I had been sitting there for 20 minutes and he was already ready to reverse my diagnosis? Cool. Story 17. I'm a man. In between the ages of 7 and 10, I was brutally assaulted multiple times. My one and only attempt to seek help from a therapist ended up being one of the worst experiences of my life. I reached out for help in my early 20s. At my first session, I was asked what had happened to me. After I gave a basic outline of the abuse, I could already see that the therapist was dismissive. She didn't seem to believe me. Then she asked about my relationship status. At the time, I was in a long-term relationship with a woman who had 2 kids, both boys. The moment she learned this, she immediately demanded my girlfriend's name, her address, and the names of the kids. She said she was going to report me to social services to ensure that I wasn't abusing them. I can't even put into words how much that shattered me. That she could look at me and see something I couldn't see. That she was so certain I would be an abuser. I started crying. She looked at me and said, "Pull yourself together." I also can't put into words the pure, visceral hatred I have for those who harm children. If I could get away with it, I wouldn't hesitate to make sure they never hurt anyone again. I would never, ever inflict the nightmare I went through on any child. I got up and left. That day I came very, very close to the edge. And after that session, I immediately ended my relationship because I couldn't deal with the thought that the kids might be at risk because of me. It's been 21 years, and I'm tearing up just typing this. That experience made sure I never sought therapy again. I survived, but it's not a good survival. Story 18. 2 situations come to mind. I often work with people in abusive relationships, and it's incredibly common for them to go back to their abuser after leaving. Some studies show that, on average, a person returns 7 times before leaving for good. I understand why they go back. Manipulation, financial control, gaslighting, love, low self-esteem, fear. But it's still hard to watch while maintaining a neutral stance. I can express concern for their safety, but I can't just yell, "For the love of everything, stop going back." What is it going to take? No matter how much I want to. The other situation isn't really about judging a person. It's about judging OCD. OCD is bizarre. The infinitely weird ways it manifests can be both frustrating and, at times, strangely fascinating. I would never judge someone for their intrusive thoughts or the compulsions their mind has linked to them. But I do judge OCD itself. I constantly marvel at how creative and downright ridiculous the human brain can be. Story 19. I'm not a therapist, I'm a doctor. I once had a patient apologize for crying during a consultation, saying, "I know I shouldn't be sad. I have so many great things going for me." Dude, 3 months ago, you had to move back in with your parents after an unexpected breakup. Back to the environment that contributed to your official diagnosis. The same house where your sister was living before she passed away just 1 month after your return. From the same diagnosis you have. And because she passed during a pandemic, you weren't allowed to visit her in the hospital before she died. You couldn't even properly organize her funeral. On top of all that, you felt financially responsible for both of your parents because they had lost their benefits. They couldn't even appeal the decision because their mental health was so poor that the thought of fighting it was making them suicidal. I want to hug a lot of my patients, but this one broke my heart. Story 20. There was a client, a young teenager, who was hearing voices telling him to hurt himself. He had multiple crisis calls and was admitted several times to crisis centers for observation. Eventually, he was prescribed medication and started showing signs of improvement. He also began opening up, revealing that he might be gay. He was terrified because his father was an old-school religious figure, a respected member of the community. It was recommended that the boy enter a treatment facility. The plan was to help him adjust to his medication, build coping skills, and give him the support he needed. His father pulled him out against medical advice. He refused to let him continue taking medication. He cut off his therapy entirely in favor of a more religious approach. 3 months later, the boy took his own life. I still see that father around, and every time I wish I could do something about it. Story 21. I'm not a therapist, but I was a patient after my mom passed away. I needed help sorting through everything I was experiencing in the wake of her death. We were discussing some deep trauma. I had been abandoned by both of my parents and severely neglected and abused by caregivers. At one point, I looked up and noticed my therapist had put down her notepad and clipboard. She was staring at me wide-eyed. I thought she was going to diagnose me with something terrible. I thought she was going to tell me I was broken. Instead, after a long pause, she said, "You need to realize how special you are. You did it. You could have been a statistic, but you beat the odds. Do you mind if we explore your childhood a little more? I want to understand what you were thinking when all of this was happening, because it might help me with other patients." That was a remarkable moment for me. She told me that not only was I normal, but she found me exceptional. We worked together in cognitive behavioral therapy for 8 months. We tackled my triggers, my attachment issues, and put me on a path toward healing. I love her. She's an incredible person who found value in my damaged past. And in a way, she allowed me to help others too. Story 22. I'm a licensed psychologist. As many have pointed out, judgment really isn't part of the job. At least, not if you've had proper training and done the necessary internal work as part of the process. That being said, not all therapists have done that work, so don't be afraid to stop seeing one if you feel it's not a good fit. I often tell my clients that my role is to be a navigator while they are the captain. I've been brought on to help chart a course from where they are to where they want to be. While I know a lot about the waters and landscape, psychology, human behavior, habits, and so on, they are the experts on the boat and crew, themselves, their lives, and their relationships. I don't expect them to take every recommendation I offer because they might know things I don't, and I respect that. My job is simply to help them adjust their course, avoid obstacles, or deal with them as they arise. It's not my job to tell them how to live, what to do, or to judge their choices, even if those choices differ from what we've discussed. It's their boat. I do, however, add this. If I suggest 20 tools or strategies and they take none, yet come back complaining about sailing in circles, then we need to have a different conversation. It's still their choice, but I'll call out concerns when I see them, with as much respect as one would when speaking to a captain. Even that conversation isn't about judgment. It's about identifying a pattern and understanding what's getting in the way. Story 23. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. Much of my work with clients focuses on learning how not to judge, whether it's their performance as employees, their value as parents or partners, or their own self-worth. Honestly, my biggest holy-ash moments come from realizing just how pervasive our tendency to judge is. No matter how accomplished or resilient someone is, they still have the capacity to judge themselves harshly, and often do. The funny thing is we judge ourselves far more harshly than others do. I'm constantly amazed at how blind people can be to their own achievements and strengths, and how unkind they are to themselves. My role in those moments is to help them see themselves with compassion, to treat themselves the way they would treat a loved one. It's a simple concept, but not an easy task, and I love every minute of it. I doubt this is the kind of response the original poster was expecting, but it's what comes to mind. Judgment is simple. It's just labeling something, a person, an idea, an object, as good or bad. It's everywhere in daily life, and it's so easy to do. The real issue is that we believe our judgments, but judgments are just thoughts, and like all thoughts, they aren't necessarily true. Helping people recognize their judgments and either challenge or let go of them is a lifelong skill, and one worth developing. Story 24. I'm a licensed therapist, and I agree with what others have said. I never judge my clients. We're trained to switch off that kind of thinking. I believe that the people who should get into this field, though I'll be honest, most therapists I've met aren't people I'd send a loved one to, do so because they are naturally open-minded. That being said, if some of my friends or family members made the same choices I've heard about from clients, I'd probably judge them, because in that situation, I'd be in a subjective role. But as a therapist, my job is to remain objective. That's the whole reason people seek therapy. Of course, that doesn't mean I haven't had plenty of this is wild moments, but that's different from judgment. Therapy is such a strange and fascinating job. There's also an important distinction between judging and expressing concern. It has to be worded carefully. If a client feels judged, you risk losing their trust and willingness to be vulnerable. And if you find yourself struggling to stay non-judgmental and can't work through it, that's when you refer the client to someone who might be a better fit. Story 25. I'm a registered psychologist, and this is a key part of our training. Our ethics, code of conduct, and standards of practice, along with our own moral compass, are things we have to reflect on daily. During my oral ethics exam, this exact question came up, and you can't just say, I would never judge anyone. I accept every single person. That's a nonsense answer. We're human too. We have emotions, biases, and reactions just like anyone else. My honest answer was that I would struggle to work with someone who willingly and purposefully tortures and kills animals for pleasure. I admitted to my panel that it would be difficult for me not to pass judgment on an animal abuser. That was the right answer. Psychologists are expected to recognize the populations they might struggle to work with, so they can ensure clients receive competent care from someone who can be objective. Story 26. I'm not a therapist, but my mom recently sought therapy to work through some of the deeply disturbing things she experienced as a child. The therapist definitely had a holy shade moment, and a judgmental one too. My mom and her family fled to Australia from Ireland in the early 70s when she was 6. Both of her parents were members of the Ulster Defence Association, UDA, which fought against the IRA during the Troubles in Northern Ireland. My grandmother in particular was heavily involved. She had killed people. As my mom was explaining some of this to her therapist, the woman actually tried to minimize her experience, saying they were probably just accountants. My mom had to shut that down fast. She told her, "Then why did we flee to Australia after their involvement in blowing up a bus? And why did we have guns hidden in our teddy bears?" The therapist was completely lost for words. Story 27. Obligatory disclaimer. I'm not a therapist, and this will probably get buried. But as a man, I really struggled with going to therapy. I was at the lowest point of my life. I've always dealt with depression, but I grew up with the just get through it mentality. The problem was, I was getting closer and closer to not getting through it. I still remember the first time I told my therapist that I was planning to kill myself. I expected the usual reaction that men get when they show emotions and vulnerability: discomfort, dismissal, maybe even judgment. But she never did any of that. She never acted like it wasn't an option, never invalidated my thoughts or feelings. She just talked me through it. This isn't exactly the point of the question, but if fear of judgment is keeping you from going to therapy, please go. It could save your life. Story 28. It's never the things people think they're being judged for. A good therapist won't judge you for how much of a substance you use, how destructive your coping mechanisms are, or the things you've done that you're ashamed of. We exist to hear those things, to recognize them, and to help you through them. You're worth that, having someone see your value despite XYZ. But if I do judge anyone, it's the parents who don't give a shit about their kids. And I don't mean the ones who are trying, who are actively working to undo generational trauma, even if they're struggling and making mistakes along the way. I'm talking about the ones who fully don't care, who make their child's life worse on purpose. As a child therapist, that's my snapping point. That's when the judgment comes rolling right out. Kids deserve better. Story 29. When I worked in crisis intervention, I visited a woman in the ER. Some of the key points from her story were that her boyfriend was a registered S offender. Her mother and best friend had told her that if she stayed with him, they would cut off contact. Her mother, who had custody of her children, also refused to let her visit them if she remained in the relationship. She admitted that after arguments with her boyfriend, she often ended up in the ER feeling suicidal, usually every 2 weeks or so. As we talked, she acknowledged that all of her problems stemmed from him. But when I asked what she planned to do, she said she wasn't going to leave him. As a rule, I never tell anyone what to do. I simply outline their choices and the consequences of those choices. But this was the first time I genuinely wanted to shake the sense into someone. In my opinion, borderline personality disorder is one of the hardest mental illnesses to work with. Story 30. When I was a student, I had a professor who was also a practicing therapist specializing in forensic psychology. He once told our class about a case that still haunts me. He had been evaluating a family after their first child committed suicide. From what I remember, the parents had always been indifferent, ignoring their child's depression and other struggles. Even after their child's death, they maintained that same cold, detached attitude, never acknowledging any underlying issues or taking responsibility. Tragically, they repeated the same pattern with their second child, ignoring his worsening mental health, and just like his sibling, he eventually took his own life. Even then, the parents remained indifferent. They showed no remorse, no grief, no acknowledgement of their role in what had happened. And then, unbelievably, they told the therapist they wanted to have another child without making any effort to change. Story 31. Honestly, I've never had a moment where I've internally criticized someone for their past or even for the choices they're making in the present. Therapy doesn't work that way. I can't do my job if I'm full of myself and projecting my own judgments onto my clients. That said, I do have reactions to people's stories. And while some might call that judging, I don't see it that way. The way the original question was phrased, I think they were asking about the harsh kind of judgment, the "what the hell is wrong with you" kind. But I can't just shut off my emotions when I hear someone's story. That whole check your emotions at the door mentality doesn't fly in therapy. If you ever meet a therapist who claims to be completely objective, run. That's just not how people work. For example, if a girl sits in my office and tells me she isn't sad that her mother died, should I suppress my reaction? If parents of a handicapped child tell me they feel relieved when their child passes away, does that mean I'm judging them? Absolutely not. But do I feel something in those moments? Of course. Or what about when I work with a guy who's so close to realizing that his partner's anxiety isn't about him? Do I get frustrated? Sure. But am I going to get mad at him? Number, being a responsible, competent therapist means acknowledging my instinctive emotional reactions and dealing with them before they interfere with my work. If needed, I consult with colleagues, confidentially and ethically, of course. I process my feelings so that I can go back and do my job properly. I love the process of change, and being honest with myself is part of that process. The last thing I'd ever want is to become critical of someone who's just doing the best they can with what they have. Story 32. When I first started college, I wanted to become a social worker. I was lucky to have an incredible professor for my first round of classes. He had been a social worker for 35 years and was the head of the offender probation unit in a major county. He even led the team when Amber went missing and worked closely with her mother. Yes, that Amber. Think Amber Alert. He was brutally honest with us students, and he brought in speakers to give us a real look at the job. By the end of that class, I realized that I didn't have the emotional strength to work with and help abusers. And I'm okay with that. I'm forever grateful and horrified by what I learned in that class, especially from the first-hand stories he shared. Instead of becoming a social worker, I've decided that I'll become a foster parent as soon as I can. That will be my way of doing social work. By providing a safe home where no child will be hurt, I will protect and love those children with everything I have. Story 33. I worked as an addictions counselor for many years before letting my license lapse and moving into a different field. I never found myself personally judging my clients for their behavior. I understood that under normal circumstances, these people likely wouldn't steal, manipulate, or lie. Addiction literally hijacks the rational, thinking part of the brain. I wouldn't judge someone with a broken arm for being unable to lift a heavy object. So why would I judge an addict for being unable to make rational decisions? That said, I did struggle with judgment when I worked with addicts who outright refused help, resisted the therapeutic process, or denied they had a problem despite overwhelming evidence. That became extremely frustrating, and honestly, that's one of the major reasons I burned out and changed careers. Story 34. I guess I do judge sometimes, but never the patients with serious problems. I struggle the most when working with people who say things like, "I'm so upset my husband only gives me $10,000 a month for shopping," or "My kid gets B's and I just can't handle it," or even, "I feel depressed because my favorite TV show ended." I understand that, for them, this might be the worst thing they've ever experienced, and I do believe that everyone who asks for help deserves it. But yeah, I judge and I know that's not right. So I made a change. Now I work with veterans and ex-offenders. I never find myself judging them. Instead, I feel like I'm actually doing something, serving my country, preventing horrific crimes. And now that I've typed that out, I realize I have some personal work to do on myself. Story 35. I'm a therapist, and this happened early in my career. I worked at a recovery center for families. One family we received had a mother with multiple diagnoses: borderline personality disorder, dissociative disorder, complex PTSD. She also had a history of domestic violence charges, battery charges, and past addiction issues. She had a couple of kids. Part of our program was helping parents relearn how to interact with their children, how to communicate without screaming, how to recognize their strengths as parents. But I'll be honest, I was fresh out of my master's program and completely out of my league. One of her kids had become the channeler of the family, absorbing all of the mother's rage, sadness, and trauma, and then lashing out at others. We worked with the mother to change how she interacted with her kids. But for her, everything was communicated through screaming, grabbing, or restraining. She was in trauma therapy, but she was still struggling. Then one day we were out on a walk, and out of nowhere, she body slammed her own child onto the concrete. The kid was only 6. I remember standing there completely stunned. I looked at my coworker, and we were both just like, "What the hell?" And in that moment, I judged. I looked at that child who just sat there wide-eyed, scared and sad, and I felt pure judgment. Story 36. I'm not a therapist, but I had a similar experience. Back in June, I hung out with a friend after not seeing her for about 8 months. She had been arrested a few days prior for destroying her boyfriend's belongings. Their relationship was extremely toxic and abusive on both ends. Anyway, as we were hanging out, I noticed she was acting very differently. She seemed paranoid and was constantly taking pictures of people. She would take a selfie but intentionally capture someone behind her, trying to be sneaky, though it was obvious. Eventually, I asked her what was going on. She hesitated, saying I wouldn't believe her, but I assured her that I would. That's when she told me that her boyfriend was the leader of an underground secret society, something like the Illuminati or something similar. According to her, he was manufacturing an unknown drug that didn't show up on drug tests and was using it to assault her and sell her to random people. She said this was why she was taking pictures of everyone. She was convinced they knew her boyfriend and would report back to him if they saw her with me. I was seriously freaked out and honestly believed she was suffering from a psychotic break or possibly schizophrenia. But the most shocking part of the story wasn't even that. It was her mother's reaction. Later that night, she went to the ER because she was suicidal. Since she had taken the only car, I picked up her mom and we drove to the hospital, though we couldn't go inside because of COVID restrictions. We called to verify she was there and spoke to the nurse who was about to conduct her psych evaluation. The nurse couldn't share any details but asked if we had any concerns or if my friend had a history of mental illness. Her mom responded that she had only been suicidal in the past. She refused to believe there was anything else wrong with her daughter. I was honest with the nurse and told her everything I had observed. That's when her mom absolutely lost it on me. She completely flipped out. And get this, she accused me of ruining their vacation. Apparently, they had plane tickets to Florida in 3 days. And because of my report, my friend was committed to a psychiatric hospital. I couldn't believe her mom cared more about a holiday than her daughter's health and well-being. We haven't spoken since, but I hope my friend is doing better. I don't regret speaking up. She can hate me all she wants, but she needed help. Story 37. After working with a client for 2 months on his substance use in inpatient treatment, I truly thought he was making progress. He had been having real discussions about change and even talking about his future goals. Then, in our next session, he told me that the real reason he had so many issues in his life wasn't because of his meth use, it was because of his mother. I listened, thinking he was about to open up about childhood trauma or a difficult relationship with her. Instead, he said, "If my mom wasn't such a terrible person, I would be living in her house right now." I asked why she wouldn't allow him to live there, and he said, "She won't let me use meth in the house." I don't understand. That's like telling her she can't take her heart meds. Internally, I was stunned. Meth will literally kill you, and he was comparing it to his mother's prescribed heart medication? Just the day before, he seemed to have made so much progress, and now this. But instead of reacting, I simply responded, "Okay, let's explore that a little more." Story 38. During my graduate program, in a first semester class, our professor asked us to examine our personal values and discuss if there were any types of clients we would feel uncomfortable serving. One of my classmates openly stated gay people, explaining that he found them disgusting. Another classmate shared that her religious beliefs wouldn't allow her to support a client considering abortion. The professor thanked them for their honesty, reminded them of their ethical obligations under the NESU Code of Ethics, but ultimately validated their right to decline certain clients, stating that if they harbored such biases, they might do more harm than good. Fast forward a year to my internship. I was assigned to provide weekly one-on-one sessions with a client who had rejected every other therapist at the agency. I was told that I was a perfect fit, but not given a reason why. When I met with the client, it became immediately clear. She was a white supremacist, and I am white. Every other therapist she had refused to work with had been either Latino or African American. After the session, I immediately set up a meeting with my on-site supervisor. I explained that I had been assigned to counsel a white supremacist and that her beliefs fundamentally went against my values. Because of this, I felt I could not ethically or effectively work with her. I expected to receive the same response that my classmates had gotten in my first-year class. I thought I would be thanked for my honesty and that the client would be reassigned. But that's not what happened. Instead, I faced significant pushback. I was told that I had to work with her, that this would be a learning and growth experience for me. I had no choice if I wanted to complete my internship and earn my required hours. It was an incredibly difficult and emotionally exhausting year. Story 39. A teenage client was assaulted at a birthday party where the adults had been giving alcohol to the minors. She called her mother, crying, and told her what had happened. Her mother's response? Stupid teenagers will do what stupid teenagers do. You'll get over it. 24 hours later, my client called me in hysterics after a suicide attempt. She told me everything. What had happened to her, what her mother had said, how she felt completely abandoned. I stayed on one phone with her while simultaneously trying to call her mother from another. Her mother refused to answer. Instead, she sent a message saying she couldn't leave work, but that the client's grandfather was flying home from Florida to take care of her. I didn't hesitate. I went to pick up my client myself and took her straight to the ER. What followed was 96 hours of absolute hell. The worst moment? When the coroner flat out refused to complete the rape kit. In front of my client, he said she just had next morning regrets and that he wasn't going to ruin some young man's life over that. I judged hard, and I didn't keep it to myself. I also nearly got arrested for tearing into that corner right there in the middle of the ER. Story 40. I'm a licensed art therapist, and I think it's important to highlight that therapists are trained to approach therapy without judgment. We learn about two key concepts: transference and countertransference. Transference refers to a client redirecting their feelings about someone else onto their therapist. Countertransference is when a therapist starts projecting their own feelings onto a client. That being said, I'd be lying if I said I've never experienced strong countertransference. I've had clients with political views completely opposite from mine. I've had clients who believed the pandemic was a hoax. I've even worked with clients who had a history of abuse, people who had been the abusers. If I were having these conversations outside of therapy, would I pass judgment? Probably yes. But therapy is different. At the end of the day, the person sitting in front of me is human. They're there because they want to face their struggles, to work through their past, to grow. They're being vulnerable, letting me see into their mind, their history, their fears, and that's what matters. Story 41. In this line of work, you quickly get used to hearing about taboo topics. Part of the job is being non-judgmental. Personally, I find it easier to avoid judgment by reminding myself that people are the way they are for a reason. Sometimes clients will come in with a brace yourself attitude or say things like, "Isn't this the craziest thing you've ever heard?" And they're often surprised when I respond as though it's the most normal thing in the world. That being said, therapists are human. We have opinions, feelings, and reactions. If you're a good therapist, you either leave those outside the session or address them professionally when you can. But we do vent to each other. And most of us, we develop a dark sense of humor. To outsiders, the things we say might sound judgmental, even cruel, but that's not the case. We just need a way to release the pressure. When we're with our clients, we are 100% present, compassionate, and supportive. That doesn't change just because afterward we say something like, "Oh my God, XYZ happened, and now I'm the one who's losing my mind." For me, it's like flipping a switch. When I'm working, my only focus is my client's well-being and how I can best support them. After work, I go back to being my everyday self. Story 42. Obligatory, not a therapist, but I was the patient. A few years after a bad car accident left me in crippling, severe chronic pain, I was struggling to cope. Every day was unbearable. The pain hadn't gotten better. In fact, it had gotten worse. And no matter how much I begged, the doctors wouldn't do anything. No pain management, no medication, nothing. I had reached my limit. I had already started preparing to end my life. The only reason I didn't go through with it immediately was my mom. I didn't want to hurt her like that. So as a last resort, I agreed to see a psychologist. I told him everything, how the pain had consumed my life, how I felt like suicide was my only escape. His response? He told me to do it. He said I should stop bitching about it and just go through with it. He told me to cut the theatrics of "I want to kill myself, but I don't want to hurt my family." He said I was obviously just looking for attention and that I needed to grow up. Either stop whining or just do it, so I did. I walked out of that session, went home, threw a rope over the rafters, put the noose around my neck, and kicked the stool out from under me. I would have died, but my stepdad came home early. He found me just as I was losing consciousness, got me down, and called an ambulance. I survived. When I was asked why I did it, I told the truth. I told the doctors and psychiatrists everything, that this so-called professional had told me to do it. People were furious. They reported him. They confronted him. And his excuse? He said he was using reverse psychology to make me realize I didn't actually want to die. I just wanted to feel better. He claimed he had miscalculated the seriousness of my desire to commit the act. And they bought it. No punishment, no consequences, no accountability. That was the day I lost faith in the system. Story 43. I'm a client, but you can always tell when a therapist is judging you. It sticks with you. Over the summer, I had to find a new therapist since my usual one was a free campus resource, and I could no longer see them. The new therapist was nice and skilled at her job, but sometimes a therapist just isn't the right fit. I decided to stick with her because we were already a month in, and I had spent that time explaining my trauma and situation. I only had another month to go before I could reconnect with my usual therapist, so I figured I could wait it out. One day I was talking about my struggle with therapy and said, growing up, I always wanted help. I wanted therapy and someone to talk to as soon as I understood what I was going through. I didn't want to become someone dangerous, to hurt myself or others. I wanted to grow. But now with all these resources in front of me, with all the information I need to grow being handed to me, I no longer want to. I don't deserve it. And then she made this awe sound like she pitied me, like she felt bad for me. I study psychology. I want to be a therapist. And I know that's not how you're supposed to react. It hit me hard. She pitied me. Therapy was different after that. Story 44. I'm a psychologist. I try really hard not to judge, and for the most part, I do a pretty good job. Everyone has their own struggles, and it's not my role to judge, just to help. However, when I was starting out, I had a patient with severe personality issues. His marriage was rocky, full of infidelity on both sides. We were discussing how this had affected him over the years when he suddenly dropped a bombshell. He had been involved in a threesome with his wife and his own brother. It was, as he put it, a form of repayment for a loan his brother had given him. I did my best to control my reaction, but I wasn't very successful. After that, he started testing the therapeutic boundaries to the point where I had to terminate our sessions and refer him elsewhere. About a month later, I was working with a different patient struggling with self-esteem issues. And somehow, once again, he admitted that he and his wife had also had a threesome with his brother. I think I did better at keeping my reaction in check that time. But seriously, what are the odds? 2 patients in 1 month? I haven't encountered a situation like that again. But ever since, I've wondered, how common is this? Later, I worked in a prison for a while, and after everything I saw there, I don't think much could surprise me anymore. Story 45. I'm a patient, or at least I was. I had been seeing a therapist for about a year, and the results were great. I had been struggling with job hunting, confidence issues, family conflicts, and depressive episodes. But with therapy, I was able to get back on my feet and reintegrate into society. I was genuinely happy. Fast forward 2 years, and everything fell apart. I lost my job due to COVID, and I started to spiral. It took me a while to admit that I needed help again, but eventually I decided that maybe just a session or 2 could help. Speaking with a familiar face seemed ideal, so I called my old therapist's office to check if he had any openings. It took them a week to respond. When they finally did, the secretary on the phone was abrupt and said, "Sorry, we won't be scheduling any more sessions with your former therapist. We don't think we can help you anymore, and believe your issues would be better handled by someone else." What? I was stunned, and honestly a little hurt. How could they decide what I needed without even asking me what was wrong? I pressed for more details, but all I got was, "Sorry, why don't you try this other location instead?" Okay, bye. And that was it. It was incredibly rude. There were so many ways they could have handled that conversation. They could have told me he was unavailable, that he no longer worked with people in my age group, that they didn't take my insurance, that he wanted to encourage independence from therapy, or that he didn't offer virtual appointments. Any reason at all would have been better than what I got. Story 46. I'm a therapist. This is a tough question to answer directly for a couple of reasons. First, there are ethical concerns about identifiable information. Therapists can't share juicy details about cases, even if they have a wild story. None of the examples I mention here are based on specific clients. but I'll try to give some insight into my job. Second, therapists should only work within their level of expertise. For example, I work with teens in a secure inpatient facility who have been found insane or not competent to stand trial after violent crimes. There's a lot I deal with that outpatient therapists might find disturbing if they were suddenly thrown into it. The question seems to imply that there's a point at which therapists start judging clients. But my brain doesn't work that way. My reaction is more along the lines of, okay, how do I handle this? Therapists build up the ability to tolerate extreme cases through experience, training, self-reflection, and supervision. I do occasionally feel overwhelmed at work, but it's almost never because of the kids I work with. It's more likely due to the fact that we're not properly staffed to intervene the way I'd like. Understaffing is a common issue in inpatient facilities due to the nature of the work. For context, I handle a lot of crises, suicidality, a lot, homicidal thoughts, psychosis, suicidal violence, both victims and perpetrators, anxiety, panic attacks, and severe self-harm. I also deal with a moderate number of cases involving obsessive-compulsive behaviors and developmental disabilities. A typical case for me involves a teen who frequently lashes out physically and is simultaneously finding creative ways to attempt self-harm. A less common but not unheard of case might involve serious harm to animals or hallucinations, commanding them to commit violent acts. Despite everything I see, I strongly believe that people act based on their personal histories, circumstances, and capacities. Even the most extreme behaviors stem from a complex mix of those factors. For inpatient work, I handle crisis interventions, SUIS assessments, and safety planning. In outpatient work, I do traditional child and family therapy. I enjoy both for different reasons. But no matter the setting, the work is intense. Story 47. I used to be a professional counselor. Earned my master's degree in everything. I primarily worked with children. One of the kids I worked with came to me after tying up a younger child and dousing them with gasoline. The only reason they didn't go through with setting the child on fire was because they were too young to figure out how to work a lighter. They were enrolled in an intensive outpatient program, but even while there, they managed to manipulate several other children into getting into trouble. One child was so severely affected that they had to be hospitalized. That night, I started searching for a new career. Now, I'm a librarian. I still use what I learned in counseling to help the public by guiding them toward professional resources, but I will never go back to being a counselor. Story 48. I'm a licensed therapist. As mentioned before, a big part of being an effective therapist is listening with empathy and without judgment. I've had clients who engage in behaviors I wouldn't personally choose, but the key is understanding the bigger picture, why they're doing what they're doing. Unhealthy or maladaptive coping mechanisms exist for a reason. They serve a function. In most cases, they're behaviors the client learned early in life, things that may have once been necessary for their survival, but are no longer serving them in a healthy way. Clients usually seek therapy because they feel lost and don't know what else to do. If we don't provide a safe, judgment-free space, we can't expect them to open up or be willing to change. That being said, I've met other therapists who were judgmental, and I can say with certainty, I wouldn't want anyone I care about being treated by them. Story 49. I'm not a therapist, but I've had my fair share of bad ones, especially after I was assaulted. When my mom found out what had happened to me, she put me in a mental hospital without my consent. While I was there, the psychiatrist told me, "You need to get better at saying no." He didn't even know the details of what had happened. No one did. I wasn't ready to share them, but he assumed. The therapist they recommended afterward wasn't any better. She told me I was lucky that I hadn't gotten pregnant or contracted an STD, saying it in a way that felt more like judgment than concern. She also had a very unscientific, hippie approach to therapy. She told me I shouldn't be on antidepressants, even though I absolutely needed them at the time. I begged my dad to let me see someone else, but he made me stick with her for 6 sessions that I hated. After that, I didn't see another therapist for 3 years. Because of those experiences, I still struggle to talk to my current therapist about my assault and my past, even though she's fantastic.